Hello everyone, welcome to my kitchen. Today we're going to talk about using up excess produce to make a delicious tangy sauerkraut. Sauerkraut in German stands for sour cabbage. But today we're not only going to use cabbage in our sauerkraut, I'm actually going to add in some delicious beetroots from the garden and some apples. This will give my sauerkraut an extra sweet flavour, and always remembering that you can use any produce in the garden to accompany the cabbage in your sauerkraut. What you're going to need to get started on your fermentation journey at home is simply some produce of choice, some clean jars sterilised, and some uniodised salt. Please make sure that you always use uniodised salt, as the iodine in normal table salt will affect the fermentation process, and the salt is such an important part of lacto-fermentation, keeping your ferments safe from bad bacteria and ensuring that you do not get sick. So first off, what you'll need to do is take off some of these outer leaves of the cabbage. I like to save these and put them aside for later, because we're going to use them as a fermentation weight to keep our sauerkraut submerged in the brine. Once some leaves have been put aside, you want to wash your cabbage and then slice it finely with a knife. Cut the cabbage as fine as possible, and if you prefer, you could use a food processor to make it easier and quicker if you were making a larger amount of sauerkraut. Once I've cut my cabbage, I'm going to transfer it into my bowl. Once I've cut my cabbage up and I've put it all in my bowl, I'm going to add 2 tablespoons of uniodised salt. The rule of thumb here is to add 2 tablespoons of salt to about a medium head of cabbage. However, what would be much better is to refer to our online brine calculator, which will help you decide how much salt you need per weight of produce that you're going to use in your ferment. This is a really good, safe way to ensure that you're using the right amount of salt in your ferment. The salt is responsible for killing the bad bacteria that could be laying in the cabbage. It creates a really good environment then by cleaning house of any bad bacteria, so that good bacteria, lactobacillus, can thrive and create lactic acid bacteria, which is what's going to preserve your sauerkraut and give it that tangy, delicious flavour. I'm just going to add the salt in onto my cabbage. And now I'm going to massage the cabbage. You can use a pounder when you're making sauerkraut, but it's much better and you'll get a better result by massaging with your hands. And what I'm going to try and achieve now is to release a good amount of brine from the actual cabbage, which will start to release. And once I've finished massaging, we'll see in the bottom of the bowl a good amount of liquid, which is actually going to preserve my sauerkraut while it ferments and keep it safe from bad bacteria. As you can see in the bottom of the bowl now, my cabbage has released quite a lot of liquid, and this is going to be the brine that's going to keep my sauerkraut safe from bad bacteria while it's fermenting. Now that I've softened my cabbage, I'm going to add in some beetroot. The thing I love about fermentation is you can definitely get creative with the flavours, and as I suggested before, the salt is just so important to keep out any of the bad bacteria so the good bacteria can thrive. So just ensure, guys, the salt isn't there for flavour, it's actually there for safety. What I'm adding in now is for flavour is some beetroot and some apple, which will give my sauerkraut a really nice sweet flavour, and also gives me a good range of produce to use up in my sauerkraut other than just cabbages. Now just adding in my apples for some extra sweetness. If you've ever tried sauerkraut before from the shops and you just haven't liked it, maybe it was too tangy or too sour, This is a perfect example of making a sauerkraut that appeals to your taste buds and introducing ferments into your life. Sauerkraut's not just limited to cabbage. Today we're putting apple and beetroot in our sauerkraut. We could put apple and dill. We could add silver beet, kale. The options are endless. Now I'm going to mix the beetroot and the apple through my salted cabbage, because it also needs to be covered in the salt, again, just to remove any bad bacteria that might be present on my produce and to create a really good environment for the good bacteria, lactobacillus, to thrive. And look at this beautiful sauerkraut that we have here. My sauerkraut is now ready to go into its nice, clean, sterilised jar. Now I have a canning tool here which helps, but otherwise you can just stuff it into the jar using your hands, and beware, it gets a little messy. Now what I want to do is I actually want to remove any air bubbles out from my jar, because when the sauerkraut starts to ferment and become active, it's going to get quite gassy. So what I will do is actually push it down. Now you could use a wooden spoon for this. I'm just using my hands today. And you'll see so much of that brine is now coming up to the surface and covering my delicious sauerkraut. Once we've finished putting the sauerkraut in the jar, it's important that the kraut is submerged in brine the whole time during the fermentation process. You can do this by using a fermentation weight, or for me, I just like to use our discarded cabbage leaf that we put aside at the start, which will work as a fermentation weight to keep all my sauerkraut under brine during the fermentation period. So here I have my washed discarded cabbage leaf from earlier. And I'm going to roll this up into a funnel and then fold it in half, and I'm going to squash it into the top of my jar, which is going to push all the brine to the top of the jar, making sure that all my sauerkraut and my cabbage leaf fermentation weight are submerged in the brine for the duration of the ferment. For this sauerkraut and for all beginners sauerkraut, I recommend a 2-week period. When you're first starting out. After you feel comfortable with fermentation, it's a good option to move to a 4-week fermentation. What does that mean? 2 weeks will give you a lightly tangy sauerkraut with all the benefits of good bacteria and a delicious side for all your meals. Once my sauerkraut is completely submerged in the brine and my jar's full, I'm going to loosely put this lid on. Now the reason we loosely put the lid on is because the sauerkraut will get very gassy during that 2-week fermentation time. It needs to sit out of sunlight on your bench, preferably somewhere where you won't forget that you have a ferment going in your kitchen. During that 2-week period, while it's fermenting, you may hear some strange noises coming from your jar. It'll be your sauerkraut singing as it builds up gases in the fermentation process. If at any time the brine levels go below and your cabbage is exposed, you are at risk of getting mold on your sauerkraut or a bad bacteria overgrowth. So to ensure this, make sure you put your sauerkraut in a spot on the bench where you view it daily to make sure the brine levels are still covering your sauerkraut and your fermentation weight. This will ensure a safe and healthy ferment. If the brine levels do end up lowering and some of the brine spills out of the jar onto the bench, simply wipe it up and top up your ferment with some water. This will ensure that it stays safe and covered during the remaining fermentation time. Once your sauerkraut has finished fermenting on the bench for 2 weeks, it must be stored in the fridge and will last up to several months. Sauerkraut is not only a delicious probiotic food, but it's a great way to use up excess produce from your garden and reduce food waste. Thank you for joining me today, and I hope this inspires you to create some delicious sauerkraut at home.